This is the Vincast, Australia's #1 wine podcast. Each episode features a different person from the world of wine, talking about their background, their philosophies, and how they both combine to influence what they do in the world of wine. You can find the Vincast on iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, and also on the Intrepid Wino website, intrepidwino.com/the-Vincast. Enjoy this week's episode. On episode 92 of the Vincast, I chat with Emma Bentley, a UK-born, Paris-based Italian winery consultant. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Garesbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. It was great to have so many people listen to the most recent episode of the podcast with Simon Colleen from Simao and Co Wines. I really saw a big spike in listeners, so that was fantastic. If you did enjoy that episode, please let me know on social media or by leave me a rating and review on the Vincast page for iTunes, because it really is great for me to have such positive feedback, because it provides some idea about how engaged the listeners are to potential guests, because I'm always looking for great guests to have on the podcast and share their stories so that you can get an insight into where people have come from that work in the wine industry. So please, when you get an opportunity, do leave a rating and a review on the Vincast page for iTunes. So this week's guest actually dialed in on Skype, and she's based in Paris. Her name is Emma Bentley, and she's worked in different parts of the wine industry for a number of years, and actually works as a wine kind of business and marketing consultant to a number of wineries in Italy, but focusing on Europe, other parts of Europe, like French-speaking Europe in particular. And so she told me about her background and what she does for the wineries that she represents. It was really an interesting insight. Please do stick around till the end so you can find out how to get in touch with both of us. But otherwise, I will see you on the other side. Emma, thank you for joining me from Paris, I believe, on a lovely early Monday morning. Thank you for popping onto Skype and for joining me on the Vincast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
As you might know, I typically start every episode of the podcast by asking my guests if they can remember how their first interaction with wine that made them think about it in a different way that pretty much set them on the path of following a career in wine.
Well, for me, I don't think it was just one moment in particular. It was more progression. It was while I was at university, and through a student organization, I made the contact with our local independent retailer, who basically over the course of 2 years just became a very, very good friend. And it was him that started opening up the nice bottles of wine. And it was through that I started getting more and more interested.
So where are you from originally?
Good question. I am originally, if you were to look at my passport, I am English.
Yes.
But that university was in Scotland, in St Andrews, and I am based in Paris, but most of my work is with Italians.
Right. Okay. So the kind of the early introduction to wine or to the finer points of wine occurred in Scotland?
Yes, in Scotland, and then after Scotland, I moved down to London and did the WSET. And so definitely, yes, I grew up with a very much more international approach to wine than what you find in France.
Mm. So when you say this person was the one who opened the good bottles, can you give me tell me what sort of wines he or she was opening, and like, was there a particular country or a particular style of wine that you were first being introduced to?
The most memorable moment, I think, was actually we had a stunning 3 bottles of Burgundy with a stunning Epoisse, and that was one of my. I can't even remember what those bottles were, but they were just. It was that memorable moment of thinking, "Wow, this is actually really good."
The combination.
Um, yeah, the pairing and the fact that the wines, the three of them, it was the same year, but they were so different. And then, but they were just, we worked from one to the other, and then, but the Epoisse also changed with the evening.
And what sort of
Um,
discussion were you having, like whilst you were, enjoying this experience? Was it about the wines, or did it
yeah, it
involve
was
other
about the,
discussions as well?
um, it was predominantly wine because it was this guy Peter who worked at that point for a shop called Louvians in St Andrews, and it was also he was the guy that taught me how to taste wine. So a lot of our discussions were about all the different flavors that you would find, um, and but I think we've talked about everything under the sun. That's the problem with wine is it starts off being very academic and it ends up at the end of the bottle you end up being more philosophical.
If you're still conscious, I guess. Um,
I'm sure at some point I have fallen asleep before ending the evening. Just a little nap around the table before starting again.
were you drinking wine from a particular place? Did you connect with a country to begin with, or was all wine just kind of interest to you?
I think at the beginning I started off much more classically French. Also because when I was a kid, my dad was actually working in Paris. And
Right.
so even though I did all my schooling in the UK, there was definitely a very, very important French component of my life. We spent our summer holidays down near Bordeaux. We were driving through the Loire. We were going down to the southwest of France too.
Yeah.
And all this, I'm sure, played into my psyche at the beginning, at least.
Okay.
Uh, Now that I've spent the last 5 years in France, I think actually now I'm known for drinking wines which are not French. But at least to
Which is
start
a
off
bit
with,
controversial, isn't it?
very controversial.
Because the United Kingdom, in particular London, is
Mm,
probably the most, I guess, diverse wine market in the world.
yes.
You could find wines from all over the planet, and even though there are certain countries which are probably a lot more representative, that
Hmm.
might mostly have to do with the amount of volume they actually produce. Of France, Italy, Spain would be pretty well
Hmm.
represented. Australia, I
Equivalent.
think, is probably an anomaly considering
Hmm.
the volume they actually produce. So you could be introduced to wines from almost everywhere, whereas in France they tend to drink French wines, and in Italy they tend to drink Italian wines, and even in Australia we drink predominantly Australian wine.
I think it's actually been one of the richness of the wine market in the UK is based on the fact that traditionally we were not a wine producing country. We were always traders. We would Bordeaux, Port, Marsala wines, all of them could trace, and Madeira as well to a certain extent, could trace their history back to the Brits.
Even the British kind of investment in for example Bordeaux, or the influence of style in Champagne
Mm-hmm.
traces a lot to the British market.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
When did you kind of make the decision to? What were you studying at university?
The world's most useless degree ever. And when I tell you what it is, you'll understand why I started drinking wine. Because it was Latin, ancient Greek, and Russian for four
Right.
years, my first master's, specializing in pre Socratic philosophy. And that was up in Scotland. That was between 2006 and 2007. Sorry, 2006, 2010. And then I came down to London in 2010, moved out to Paris in 2011.
So
Um,
when did you make the decision that you'd kind of follow a career path in wine?
It was towards graduation day, because obviously with a master's in Latin and Russian, you're not the most desirable person. It was also after the economic crisis when jobs were not, well, totally plentiful. And I actually signed up then to do a second master's in European business, which was going to take me from London through to Paris. And it was during that time that, as well as doing that second master's, I was also training up at the WSET school. And then when I moved to Paris, I started frequenting a lot of the wine tastings.
So you weren't necessarily working in the wine industry at all?
I had worked, like I think most people, when you're sort of 16 to 18, 19, worked in restaurants in the UK and then in a pub for all my gap year, so when I was 18. And then when I was at university, I was also working as a silver service waitress. So even though I wasn't at that point trained in the wine industry, I wasn't a sommelier or anything, but I was at least doing a lot of different jobs on the floor
In
and service
hospitality.
industry. Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So, did you started the second masters?
Yes, I did the second master's. I
You did the
finished
second
up in
masters.
Paris, and then at the end of that, I kind of had three options. One was ideal option was to stay in Paris and find myself a job in the wine industry. Option two was to stay in Paris, do something else, which was going to pay a little bit more money than working in wine, but with the idea of going and maybe doing some sort of master's wine training later on, because there are a couple of big wine schools in France that were quite attractive at that point. But then third option would have been gone back to London and work in the wine trade there.
So
So it
you were
was
set on working in the wine business.
yes,
Okay.
yes. Even at one point, even at that business school, the director of the school in Paris, when I told her that I wanted to work in wine, she was horrified. She thought, well, she actually told me that if all I wanted to do with the rest of my life was open bottles of wine, that she would not sign my degree certificate to let me graduate.
Goodness gracious. It's a bit
Yeah, I
serious.
know. This is even France. I know. So I've now proved her wrong. And she signed that certificate. And actually, what's quite funny now is that they've invited me back several times to talk to the current students as sort of the alumni coming back saying, oh, I started up my own business. I'm an entrepreneur, etc., etc. And now she's actually quite proud of me and for what I've done. So it
Hmm.
just shows how 5 years can change.
And your parents, how do they feel about you kind of possibly slightly not utilizing, your studies in ancient languages and that sort of thing?
Well, I think they're just more of anything else. They're actually just confused about where my interest in wine and food came from.
Were they
Because it's not
very interested
something
in
I've
wine at all?
inherited through our DNA, no.
Okay.
But I think that they know I'm happy, and I think that as parents, I think, well, I think they probably when you have a child, you probably you have your expectations and you think, okay, this is what I want my son or daughter to do as they grow up. Well, I think they learned pretty soon that I was not going to be doing the conventional path.
Mm,
But I think they see that I'm happy, so they don't mind too much that I'm not speaking ancient Greek on a regular basis anymore.
sure. So,
Yeah.
you were in Paris, you'd finished your second masters. What did you end up deciding to do?
Well, in the end, I had a stroke of luck and was offered a job at a wine shop in Paris. It's one of the most historic wine shops and it was specialized in natural wine. And so they offered me an internship. And then in the end, I actually only did 6 weeks there before there was another job opening that happened in one of the sister companies in the same group. And that was importing foreign wine into France.
Right, okay. And had you had much exposure to natural wines before then? Were you interested in natural wines?
It was, I think, it was one of the first moments really when I got into natural wine because before 2010 in the UK, or at least where I was up in Scotland, there was not much talk of natural wine. The idea of organic agriculture and sulfites and all the rest of it hadn't made it up there.
Wow,
And so it
okay.
was coming down to Paris and then being exposed to producers, I don't know, like Ganvar, René Moss, Piffling, Pacalé at that point. There's Christian Chaussat still. And all these guys, when they were so passionate, and you're like, well, actually, this is great. And then I suppose it all started off at that point. So that was 2011.
Was it something in particular that you connected with as far as the low intervention wines?
Yes. I mean, on a sort of on a health basis, one of the things I remember from being a kid was always wash your fruit before you eat it, even if it's an apple or a pear. And when you think that actually when you have grapes, you can put all sorts of chemicals and whatever on them, but you don't wash the grapes before you press them. And that for me, I was like, oh yeah, actually, what else goes in the grapes and in the vineyards? So from a health basis, that was important for me. But also when I was at school, my secondary school, there was a farm attached just next door. And I used to, for about 3 different seasons, go down and help with in particular with the lambing season. But also they had horses and we made our own bread and I actually used to blacksmithy too. And there's a lot of the winemakers who work, let's say naturally, also have the farm which goes with it. And that was also something that with time, I've realized that that's where my roots actually started and I've now gone back.
Mm. That sort of connection to
Mhm.
to agriculture and farming.
Yeah, yeah. And that appeals to me as well, much more than sort of conventional winemakers, where the idea is just to get the highest yield possible.
Mm. So tell me how your introduction to natural wine in particular sort of took form. How did they kind of, I guess, teach you about this particular style of wine?
I think it was also a very progressive thing. It was just by meeting lots and lots of different winemakers at wine tastings, then going from my side to go and visit them and to go and see the vineyards. And I've had the chance, I worked for that company for about 2 years. Then I moved off somewhere else. But I've always had this interest in wine, and I was always able to go around and spend a few days here and there. So in Champagne, in the Loire, in Alsace, down in the southwest in Beaujolais. And so every time I go visit a couple of new producers. And then just by progressively putting all the different elements in, how each different producer works, it was then just interesting. I've got a nice little mosaic now of all the different possibilities.
Mm. And did you have
Mm.
particular favorite producers or regions initially?
Initially, I think initially I just wanted something not quite the most extreme wines, but the most interesting, hard to find. I was very, very thirsty for not the rare wines and the rare grape varieties, and trying to learn as much as I could. I read quite a lot, so I have a lot of reference books on my shelves,
Mm.
and I'm always going back. So, for example, if I taste something new, I'll go back and Janssen Robinson's Wine Grapes is one of the most consulted books, and I'm always trying to connect this and trying to put together more and more elements. And the thing with what I find fascinating about the wine industry is that even though you feel okay, I've been around for now a few years, like I've still got a lot to learn, but there's even more things still to discover, and that's really
Absolutely.
cool. I like that. Yeah.
So, tell me about your experience working as far as importing wine into France, because as we sort of
Yeah.
said, the French typically drink French wine.
Yes, and there's also a huge amount. The biggest problem that we had importing wine, and it wasn't at that point, it was natural, but also a lot of really very prestigious winemakers from all over the world. It was the lack of knowledge of the average French person, even sommeliers. There's still a lot that needed to be essentially the land needed to be plowed first, and to just before you could go in and say, okay, this is a really good example of let's say even like a Californian wine, is that the first of all you had to say, actually no, the French need to be grounded and be told, okay, actually this can be good. Don't have your prejudices, don't have your sort of, oh, it's not good, it's new world. No, just taste it. And so a lot of tastings that I would like to do would always be blind tastings, and normally they would actually find themselves, these French consumers, being very surprised.
Mm. So how
um
do you break down the barriers for them? How do you sort of make them unlearn prejudices and assumptions they have about non-French wine, or even French wine for that matter?
I still don't have the answer to that. I'm still working on it.
Time.
What I can say, a lot of time, but also what I quite like is that I've seen that there's a difference between the generations. So there will still be the type of consumer who will drink labels, who wants this kind of Burgundy in this year because it was the best. And I think now that I've learned that it will require somebody with a lot more patience than me to go around and convincing them to be trying something foreign. But that there's a new generation coming through, the one that have traveled, who are slightly maybe more open-minded. And fortunately, that's my generation. And they're also interested and thirsty to try new things. And I think it's with them that I'm having the most success in trying to say, okay, look, try this. It's a wine that comes from, I don't know, Sardinia, for example, where you wouldn't, I mean, the French, they have no idea. First of all, the thing has to be, where is Sardinia on the map? And then we talk about the grape varieties that you find there.
Do you think that the big difference between the generations is that I guess as consumers, in this case, wine consumers, they're a lot more experiential, whereas our probably our parents' generation are a little bit more like what they're told or what they read, and it's sort of, we have this very strong relationship with our local wine merchants, and what if they like, I trust them to know what's a great
Mm-hmm.
producer and what's a great vintage, and I'll make my decisions based on that. Whereas younger people think about, a bar or a restaurant they love going to, and they're introduced to this new wine, they go, hey, that's so cool. Or as you say, they travel and they
Mm-hmm.
go and they sip wine in a bar in Paris that they've never heard of, and they kind of connect with the experience rather than the actual kind of name or vintage, or like they have. And I think maybe they're also a little bit more visual, which is possibly
Mm-hmm.
explains the slightly different and more eccentric kind of labeling of natural wines.
Yes. Yes. I definitely agree with you. I think there is a much more experimental level to young people wine drinking in Paris. I think they they also tend to click more with wine makers more than with wine regions. And this is also a long debate for which there's no answer, but what is the future of the appellation system
Mm.
of, especially with winemakers, conventional versus natural? But there's definitely now there seems to be much more a cult following around certain winemakers, which I don't think there was before in quite the same way. Whereas before, I think we would talk about regions and villages and appellations. Now it's like, oh my God, this guy's cool. And I think also you get a lot of very, very quirky characters in the wine. And the people making wine now, they may have done other careers and they've gone back to the land and they've decided to start making wine. And with all that, there's actually something that you can attach to. It's gone beyond just the pressed grapes put in a bottle, and it's much more the experience of, oh, we're buying from this person and we're getting you're buying into, not quite, I don't want to say the brand, but you're buying into the persona.
I think where I probably disagree with you slightly there is I think it's not
Hmm.
necessarily about the wine maker, but more it's about wine growers. So people who are,
Yes, okay.
to a large extent, they're growing and producing the wines themselves, because
Hmm.
in the 80s and 90s in Australia, and probably in the 2000s as well, winemakers were the rock stars. They were the ones who they might work for another, for, like they're employed, but they're always the ones who are put forward as this is the winemaker, and they're the ones who are crafting these amazing wines. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, the grape growers themselves, the viticulturists, were not really talked about as much,
Hmm.
and that's, I think, part of the like it's probably changing a little bit in Australia as far as the style of winemaking, but to a certain extent, it's still the winemaker is the rock star. Whereas in Europe, in France and Italy in
Hmm.
particular, people are connecting with the person who actually has their land. They grow the grapes in an organic or biodynamic way, and they craft
Hmm.
the wine in their style. And I think they're connecting with people as someone who actually takes it from start to finish.
Yep, that's a very good point. It's an interesting distinction to make, yeah.
Because I know, like, probably the place in Europe, well, there's probably two, but Bordeaux and Champagne are
Hmm.
famous for the winemakers or the chef de cave. They are
Yes.
the person. They never talk about, and it's part of the reason why I think those are two places that where terroir is least relevant, because they're
Hmm.
talking about the technique and they're talking about the man who makes it, or woman in very rare cases,
Yes.
sorry,
No,
who
it's still
make the
very rare.
decisions. Yeah. Well, there's
It's one of
actually
these.
this report just came out in Australia today about women in the wine industry, and it's pretty damning if it's true what they're saying. But there's this big disparity between what women are paid as winemakers, where the opportunities are, how many job or females are employed in wineries, that kind of thing. And I think that's probably the case in Europe. You probably would agree.
I think it's possibly even worse in Europe. Let me just tell you a little story that was October of last year, so 2015. And I had just got back from doing harvest and then working also in the cellar in Italy. And
Whereabouts?
it
I
was a
was in
wine
Italy.
tasting. I was harvesting in Soave,
Okay.
in the village of Castelcerino. It's the highest hill for a guy called Filippi. And then I was working in the cellar for Stefano Bellotti in Piedmont. I
Right.
arrived with Stefano on the very day that they celebrated the harvest party. So all the grapes had been brought in, and I just had to go and would be the cellar rat during the remontage,
Hmm.
which is good. So I just got back from Italy, and I was back in Paris doing a wine tasting right in the centre here. I was talking to this guy that had been making Burgundy for a very long time, then moved over to the Loire and was running one of the big cooperatives in the Loire. And he was like, "Oh, well, how do you find being a woman in the wine industry?" And I was like, "Well, it's not easy, but it's okay." He's like, "No, what I meant was, I mean, do they actually let you go in the cellar?" I'm like, "Yes." You must be joking. Of course. I mean, I've just got back from Italy. I was in the cellar every day. They're like, "Oh, but you know what? In France." And then he called over his friend to corroborate, and the friend who makes wine down in Bordeaux agreed with him that apparently there are still places in France where women are not allowed in the cellar, especially during fermentation, because apparently if the woman is at a certain time of the month, the wine will go cloudy.
That's like that
And so these two,
ridiculous assertion
you know,
that bears can smell women, at that period, and they'll be attracted and they'll attack you. That's ridiculous.
oh, it took me a very, very long time to get over the shock of that statement and the fact that I sort of said that's absolutely not possible. Like I've gone down. Nobody has ever, well, at least as far as I know, has ever raised an eyebrow about me walking into a cellar because I'm a woman.
I have to
Um,
apologize to all my female listeners because that I find that deeply offensive.
well,
I'm quite
yeah,
shocked.
I was flabbergasted for a very, very long time about that, and he was like, "No, of course there are still places in France where you wouldn't be allowed in."
But
I think there's quite a lot that I mean
oh
I in the
god,
wine industry I see what I see, but I'm sure there's also a lot of maybe traditional French, let's say, attitudes to which well I'm not privy.
yeah.
But if this is the attitude, then I would say maybe quite a good thing for my heart rate
If that's the
that
tip
I'm
of
not
the
privy to these
iceberg, then
conversations.
then we're in trouble.
Oh well, it's that was that was quite something.
Goodness gracious. Well,
Well,
do you know what I found when I was traveling? I did actually find that Italy probably was the best as far as women working in the wine industry, particularly as far as women running estates.
yes.
I think this is it's further north, maybe in France, maybe in Germany, they possibly prefer to pass on their business, their winery, to a son rather than to a daughter. Whereas in Italy,
Hmm.
they're possibly a little bit more relaxed about that, which I was actually quite surprised about that. But that was just that's very anecdotal, of course, based on my
Hmm.
experiences. But I did find that Italy was a little bit more progressive as far as women working in the cellars and the vineyards.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, even just if I do a quick count in my head of the iconic female producers, I can think of more wine growers and winemakers down in Italy than I can in France. And
Yeah,
it's just,
absolutely.
this is still 10 o'clock in the morning for
and
me. I'm
and
now
and
about
quite
three
a few
coffees
of the
in,
really
but
big names as well. Elisabetta Foradori and Ariano Occhipinti.
exactly.
Two
Yeah.
of the
And you've
most
also got like
famous.
Elena de la Stoppa and you've got Anna from Valgiana. You've got
Yep,
a lot of, sort of in France, I can think of
Francesca
two of
Massavecchia now running the estate.
three. Yeah. Yeah, Laura. So you've got a lot of, yeah, I think I don't know why that is exactly. I mean, I think you might be onto a point that it's something to do with leaving the estate down to the a relative ease of leaving an estate down to a daughter than to a son.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's curious. But it's true that in Italy, I don't think I've had this, like, well, at least I hope that nobody's ever sort of behind my back gone, oh God, we shouldn't have let her in the cellar. Um, it
So,
was, yeah.
so when you were you started working, sort of looking at importing wines
Mm.
into France, was Italy the kind of the first country that you really connected with, as far as a wine producing country outside of France?
Um, yes. But I also landed up with the Italians also completely by chance. Because having worked for the importers, I moved on into the spirits industry for 2 years. And
Really?
then, yeah, for about, well, actually 18 months, I was working, yeah, for a company importing whiskey, gin, vodka, tequila, pisco, you name it, we probably imported it. Um, and I was working there. And then after about 18 months, I was like, you know what, I want to get out of this and I want to go back to the wine industry. So that's when I set up my own business, sort of doing some consultancy for winemakers. And I thought at the time what I was offering was sort of a service based helping winemakers import their wines into Europe by having a girl on the ground here who could act as an ambassador. And I thought at the time that it would be appealing to other native English speakers who were further away. So I was thinking of Australia, I was thinking of the US, I was thinking even, I don't know, I was thinking much further afield. And actually, at a wine tasting down in the Loire at the Renaissance tasting, it was there that there was just a stand of Italians who I'd met several times before, but they said, "Oh, what are you doing now?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm just starting up this business," explaining that it would be sort of your girl on the ground in Europe. And they're like, "Well, we'll take you." And it's not just me or him. It's going to be there can be 10 of us if you want. And then it started by that, really. And I found that the Italians have been so generous and so welcoming. And so it was as a result of that that I quickly got out the Italian dictionary and the grammar book and then put my old Latin skills to use by having to learn Italian. Um, but there's a synergy between French wine and Italian wine because there's this old tradition of family estates, of really of a slower way of living, and also without there's not the same glamour, especially in the Italian regions, because I don't work with any, for example, Barolo or Brunello producers. Mine is sort of much more scattered and in much, well, less reputed areas. And that for me has been a challenge as well. It's explaining to the French again, sort of, what is this wine? Like, do you know what a Soave wine is? Do you know, well, a Sicilian wine, which is not from Mount Etna? Um, and all these things have been part of the challenge. But there's definitely something, I love the diversity of Italian wine. And I think there's actually more diversity in Italy than there is in France. And so for somebody like me, who's, as I started off by saying, is so curious and always wanting to learn more, Italy was, yeah, a natural progression for me to orientate myself towards.
So
Um,
when you say you like with the kind of your girl on the ground in Europe,
yeah.
where
Hmm.
do you sort of, are you mostly working in France or do you head into different parts of Europe as well?
I do French-speaking markets in particular. So let's France, Belgium, Switzerland, part of Switzerland, of course. I've been delving a little bit more and more into Holland and Luxembourg, which are important markets, even though we could sort of consider them small. They actually consume quite a lot of wine. And obviously, my native UK, I go back there all the time too for different wine tastings and going, especially for the winemakers who don't speak English or French confidently.
Right.
I think I can be a useful support in that respect.
And are these to a large extent markets that are still just discovering this particular style of wine?
Mm,
Or
for the
are they
UK,
established for natural wine?
um, it's different because also when you talk about, even for example, a country like France, one thing is Paris and the rest is, well, the rest of France is quite another thing. I think the UK is much more, is definitely at least a good step and a half ahead of the other countries in terms of knowing what, for example, like a Soave wine is, because we had that trend for, okay, we thought it was bad wine, but at least we're familiar with the name. Whereas there are still certain places, I'm thinking I've done tastings recently in Brussels where I was having to explain from scratch what is Soave and what the grape variety is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they might be a step ahead of the UK in terms of natural winemaking. Because even a place, so if I think of Brussels again, you've got breweries like Cantillon, which do their wild yeasts
Mm.
and very, very native, very low intervention beer brewing.
Yeah. The
And for them, it's not
sour
yeah,
beers.
exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. And it's not a huge step away for them to go into natural wine.
Yeah, I suppose if you can kind of put it in context for them, if you can give them a
Mm,
reference point. Well, you guys are very familiar with your beer, aren't you? Well, here's how we
hmm
can apply some of the techniques or some of the concepts of that product, and let's apply it to wine. And then it's just a question of, and now we put it in the context of where it is in Italy, and and what the variety is,
hmm
that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
So what do you do as far as a consultant to these various producers? I'm assuming you're not
hmm
kind of going in to their customers and actually selling the wines.
I sometimes do.
Okay,
So it depends. So I on a it also depends for each winemaker because each of them have different challenges.
sure,
But to put it briefly, basically what I will do is I can look over export markets and say, okay, we need to find an importer in these countries because currently you're not represented.
right,
Um, then it will be working with that importer hand in hand. So obviously they keep the stock, but I'll go around and sort of spend 2 or 3 days per month, every couple of months, whatever the frequency needs to be, um, as a reinforcement. Because generally speaking, I think, well, this is also why for me it's important to go and work in the vineyards and work in the cellar and to really know the wines that then I will be helping to sell. So training up the importers, doing staff trainings for their team, and then going around visiting clients. So if it's a country that I don't know so well, I'll be going around very much with them doing ride withs. If it's a place like Paris or Belgium or London where I have a little bit more autonomy, then it will also be for me to go around to different natural wine accounts. Chances are it's a friend of mine who's working there. And then I at least will talk to it and then put them in contact with the distributor.
right.
There's a part of me which is as an accompaniment for the distributor, but there's also a part of me which goes through directly to clients and says, look, this wine's great, this is why, and this is the guy you buy from.
And
Uh,
you also would sort of run, educational components as well.
yes, I do. I was at the what's it called, Imbibe Live last year in London doing a masterclass, speaking at a masterclass on native grape varieties of the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
That was for about 40 or 50 sommeliers in the UK. I've done recently in Paris, there was a tasting where I put together a table of Italian wines. It was in the 16th arrondissement's town hall, and it was a tasting on rare varieties. And so I go try and find all the different curious things, and then that come back, and you're talking then to the public about, okay, this is really weird and wonderful, but this is why you should try it.
Mm.
And then also I work in Paris. I work in a wine bar. So that's what I was doing last night until about 2 o'clock in the morning, which makes it very
Goodness.
difficult this morning. And I'm back there again this evening. And yeah, and they, funny enough, so they're a bar to whom I sell the wines which I've also seen in the cellar. So
Right.
it's quite fun. I can go when I'm talking to the final client who's drinking in the wine bar, I can say, actually, I know this winemaker very, very well. And at the same time, I can go back to the winemaker and say, oh, so your wine actually was really received very, very well by, for example, this Japanese sommelier that came in the other night. And it's quite interesting seeing the full cycle from the bud to the bottle.
So you're able to actually provide them with feedback from every single step in the chain, as far as their
Yes,
importer,
yes,
the sales force, the trade customer, and then the final end consumer.
yes, yeah.
And speaking of the end consumer, you also will sometimes represent them at wine shows.
Yes, yeah. Quite a large component of my job is being the dog's body, but the one that goes around to all this and stand all the different wine fairs and will be on that stand representing the wines. And it's interesting as well because you meet such a huge range of consumers. between the professionals who are really very, very precise and they're very knowledgeable, to then the journalists who go around trying to find something to write about, and then to the end consumer who you have to start from zero, but they can really be, especially this just past weekend, there was a tasting in Paris, and there are a lot there that just found who are really interested and very curious to discover new wines. And so that's always exciting when you see sort of spark behind their eyes. You're like, oh, great, they're enjoying this.
That's exciting.
Yeah. But also, I mean, the advantage as well for the Italians is that it's tiring being on the stand all day, every day, especially when it's not in your native language. And
Yeah.
so, especially for the trade fairs and consumer fairs in Paris and Brussels and England, it's normally me that does the speaking, and I end up with no voice at the end of it.
This is just a hazard of the job, I guess.
It is. At least there's wine, which sort of keeps you, well, I'm always drinking something to keep me hydrated, let's say.
Yeah. So as far as some of the natural wines outside of Europe, have you had much opportunity to taste some of those?
I first exposure to natural wine outside of Europe would have come from the importer that I was working with, because they had producers that I'm sure your listeners would be familiar with, like Julian Castagna in Beechworth, Victoria. We had Maverick as well. We imported them. We then also had I'm going through Argentina and Chile in my mind. We imported a Mexican wine, but that was far from being natural. In the US, we had a lot of very prestigious wineries then, but the natural ones I think have come to Europe a little, arrived in Europe after I left that company. So people like Dirty and Rowdy, they're very, very boutique Californian winemakers. They come over to France for the natural wine fairs in the Loire, La Dive Bouteille in particular. So I've seen them a couple of years, and it's interesting seeing the progression of their vintages because they're really going somewhere. Also, Georgian wine, that's been a huge thing that I think really only came to France 3 years ago maximum. But they're now very present. I see them quite a lot, and I love that style of wine.
Yeah, well, it was fascinating chatting with John Verdeman on a previous episode. What probably I would say one of the best. And he talked about getting introduced to. Sorry.
He's also one of the most emblematic figureheads of the Georgian wine movement, because he's somebody that you can he's got such a fascinating story.
But he can also connect with lots of different people as well. Whereas
Absolutely.
I think a lot of his colleagues in Georgia really have they don't have a lot of exposure to what it is outside of Georgia as far as other wines and wine consumers and markets, that kind of thing. So I think that he's a fantastic bridge for them to introduce their culture and their wines to more consumers outside of Georgia.
Absolutely.
Well, Emma, I really do appreciate you making some time, particularly as you are working to the wee hours of the morning. Is there a way for people to find out more about what you do and of course follow you on social media?
Yes. So my website is very simple. It's emmabentleyvino, vino.com. I have a blog, which is emmabentleyvino.wordpress.com. And then I'm also on Twitter. It's emmabentley87.
Well, I certainly I hope that we'll be able to meet each other in person at some point. Most likely in Europe, I would think, probably because Australia is so far away for you to come. But
it is a very long way, but it does tempt me.
Well, you know that you'll have people to look after you when you do come. But look, thank you again. It's been lovely chatting, and
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And as always, I'd love for you to follow me on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Intrepid Wino. And the podcast can be found on Twitter at the Vincast. Facebook.com/Intrepid Wino is where I have my Facebook page where I share all my links. And of course, you can find me on YouTube on the Intrepid Wino channel where I post lots of different videos. A lot of the time they are my Let's Taste wine tasting videos. subscribe to the podcast on any different podcast hosting app or platform, particularly iTunes, and that way you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. And I would love for you to give me a 5-star rating and leave a review. All that information can be found at intrepidwino.com, as well as lots of different writings that I've done in the past. But thanks for listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode. But until then, bye.